In the fields where tobacco once grew thick beneath the sun and blood of colonial Maryland, there is a silence now so complete that it rings louder than any church bell ever did the hills of Anne. Arundel County rolled gently toward the coast, but they cover something sharp and cruel beneath them. A wound in the land that the Catholic Church has tried to keep from bleeding for over 200 years. A name so feared that even now when it's spoken in whispers by old men in parishes lit, only by candlelight you can see their hands tremble as they cross themselves and glance toward the door. That name is Thornton. Not just a man, not just a family, but something colder, something more deliberate, something so rotten at its core that the church itself pretended it never existed, and still does, for between the years of 1734 and 1768, 12 parishes in Maryland fell under their control slowly, subtly, like a sickness that begins with a single cough and ends with a body in the ground. The Thorntons did not come with swords or armies. They came with collars and smiles, with sermons and confessionals, and promises of salvation. And the terrible beauty of their method was this: they used the holiest act in Catholicism, the sacrament of confession, to build an empire of surveillance, control, and eventually death. This is not a tale of religious corruption. This is a record of psychological warfare, waged from behind altars, a war in which the weapons were not bullets or blades, but secrets whispered in the dark by men and women desperate to be forgiven. War where every sign became a currency, every prayer a trap, and every priest a spy, and the commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," was turned on its head by men who bore witness to every crime, every lust, every betrayal, and then used those confessions to bend entire communities to their will. The story you are about to hear is not folklore. It is not fiction. It is a reconstruction from sealed church archives, fragments of coded journals found behind a wall in a farmhouse near Havenwood, and from testimonies that were suppressed for centuries, buried deeper than any grave, because they revealed something too dangerous to be spoken aloud, that the church knew and did nothing, or worse, that it helped. Before we go any further, you need to understand something. This is not for the curious. This is not for the religious. This is not for the casual listener. This is for those who are ready to see what lies beneath the skin of history and feel the cold truth that changes you forever. Because once you hear what the Thorntons built, once you understand the machinery of their operation, you cannot go back. Your world will be altered. Your faith, if you still have it, will sit differently in your chest, heavier, sharper, more fragile than it was before. So if you are still here, then keep listening and know this: you were warned. It begins in 1734 in a town called Havenwood, a port settlement of no great size, but considerable influence, situated along the Severn River 20 miles southeast of Annapolis. Havenwood was Catholic territory, not officially, not by law, but in every practical sense. The Calvert family's legacy still loomed over Maryland, a Catholic refuge in a Protestant world, and Havenwood was their pearl, a town of 800 souls, almost all Catholic, their lives bound together by tobacco trade, plantation wealth, and the iron rhythm of mass confession penance. Mass again, the Curthers owned 3 plantations and a fleet of merchant vessels. The Whitmore family controlled the largest tobacco warehouse between Baltimore and Annapolis, and the Ashfords traded not just in tobacco, but in human beings and slaves, brought from Africa and sold beneath the thin veil of economic necessity. And standing at the center of this town was St. Bartholomew's Church, a brick structure of no great beauty, but great authority. Its bell tower, visible for miles, its pews carved from oak, its walls thick enough to withstand pirate raids and storms, but not the thing that was about to come. Into this town stepped a man named Father Thomas Thornton, tall, pale, with eyes like cracked ice and hair already gray, though he was not yet 50. He spoke with a voice trained in European seminaries, smooth, educated, refined, but behind his gaze there was something else, something calculating, something that saw the soul not as a thing to save, but as a thing to map, to measure, to own. He claimed he had come to tend the spiritual needs of heavenwood, and perhaps he believed it, perhaps he believed. In his own twisted version of salvation, but what he did first was simple and horrifying. He asked to install new confessional booths, not one or two, but 4 elaborately crafted structures made of dark oak with detailed carvings of saints and angels. The congregation saw them as a gift, a sign of Father Thornton's devotion. But they were wrong. They were so wrong because those confessionals were traps, each one a listening device, crafted by Thornton's nephew Marcus, a carpenter trained not in Philadelphia, as claimed, but in the brutal pragmatism of espionage. Each booth contained metal tubes, hollow and hidden, that funneled the voice of the penitent down beneath the church to a concealed chamber where another nephew Samuel sat with ink and paper and wrote down every word in cipher, every whisper of adultery, every lie told in business, every plan to cheat taxes or seduce a servant was transcribed in detail and catalogued, not for the sake of God, but for the sake of power and profit, for the Thorntons did not want to forgive. Sin, they wanted to hold it. They wanted to store it in ledgers and files and use it as leverage, as blackmail, as the leash with which they would drag the colony to its knees. They began with Richard Whitmore, one of Havenwood's most respected men, who entered the booth in February of 1735 and confessed his affair with an indentured servant named Catherine Mills. The affair had consumed him with guilt. He spoke of it as a sickness, a torment, and he wept as he begged Father Thornton for guidance and forgiveness, and Father Thornton gave it with a smile and a blessing and a suggestion that perhaps a charitable donation might help ease the burden of sin. £50, initially £10 each month after that, and Whitmore agreed, telling himself that it was the price of peace with God, that he was funding the salvation of others, never realizing he was the first brick in a wall of darkness. And from that moment it grew like rot in wood, quiet at first, then unstoppable. Thornton trained his nephews, not just to build and listen, but to become priests themselves, ordained through the proper channels. Their documents reveal their training. Sufficient to fool anyone, they were placed in other parishes, St. Michael's in Easton Street, Joseph's near Chestertown, and in each one they installed their booths, their tubes, their ledgers, and the process repeated: find the wealthy, find the guilty, find the ones who would rather pay than be exposed, and offer them forgiveness with strings that would soon wrap around their throats. And so Maryland's confessionals became not places of mercy, but places of extraction, where secrets were mined like gold and stored like weapons, and those who dared to speak honestly found themselves trapped in a cage they could not see held, shut by the fear of shame, the terror of exposure, and the weight of holy authority, now twisted into something unholy, something monstrous. And still it grew, for by the end of 1736 the Thorntons had identified 16 more parishes, ripe for infection, and they were already preparing their expansion letters, written in code, moved between the churches, appearing innocent but carrying maps of sin and shame beneath their words. And the church, the greater church, the hierarchy in Baltimore, they did nothing, or they knew and chose silence. And is that not worse? But worse was still to come, for the Thorntons were not content with money. They wanted influence. They wanted control, and they were willing to kill for it. And when the first body was found, a man who had once resisted their demands, found dead in his home with no sign of struggle, they called it heart failure, but those who saw him said his eyes were wide open and his mouth twisted as if he'd seen something terrible in his final moment. And those who understood knew he had said no and paid the price. And the Thorntons learned that fear was as useful as guilt, and they began to use it as well. And so now you understand what was built beneath those hills. Not just a system, not just a crime, but a legacy of fear that stained the soil and twisted the faith of an entire colony. And the question now is this: are you still listening? Are you still willing to hear what comes next? because it only gets darker from here. And once you enter Havenwood, there is no turning back. In the year of our Lord 1734, as the dying leaves of autumn curled, along the stone path that led to the town of Havenwood, a man arrived whose name would one day be erased from every church record yet, whose shadow would linger in every whispered. Prayer Father Thomas Thornton came not on a holy mission, but under the weight of calculations, already made decisions already sealed, and sins already measured in coin blood, and silence Havenwood nestled along the Severn River seemed like salvation. To the weary and the devout, alike its churches clean, its streets quiet, its citizens proud of their tobacco wealth, and their unbroken Catholic lineage despite the Anglican pressure mounting just beyond the forests. But Havenwood was not salvation. It was soil ripe for infection, and Father Thornton came as no healer. He came as the needle. He rode in on a black gelding, whose hooves struck the ground like hammer blows, and with him came silence, a stillness that passed through the townspeople unnoticed at first, yet soon would grow into something they would mistake for reverence, and later recognize as fear. He wore the collar. Yes, the long black coat, the silver cross around his neck, and the worn leather Bible tucked beneath his arm, but there was something else beneath the surface, a sharpness to his smile, a patience in his gaze that belonged not to a shepherd of souls, but to a man who understood how to break another man without touching him. The town greeted him with warmth, unaware they were welcoming the architect of their undoing. He took up residence in the rectory behind St. Bartholomew's Church, a brick structure whose modesty had always been mistaken for humility. Though its foundation held more than stone, it held secrets wrought, and soon a new kind of machinery. He walked the nave alone at night, his boots echoing against the wooden pews as if memorizing the acoustics, testing the silence for fault lines. And it was during those first nights that he drafted the plans that would turn a church into a trap, a parish into a prison, and confession into commerce. He told the elders that the spiritual needs of Havenwood were growing, that the sins of the faithful weighed heavier. Now that the devil's temptations were growing subtler, he said the solution was more confession, not less, not the crowded lines of once a week, but daily absolution, hourly repentance. He proposed the construction of 4 new confessional booths, carved from oak, imbued with sacred iconography, and designed to honor the dignity of the sacrament. But what he did not say is that these booths were not designed for the soul, they were built for the ear. The townspeople welcomed his fervor the way drowning men welcome hands they do not yet realize are pulling them deeper. They did not question the cost, the labor, the precision with which the confessional walls were measured and reinforced. They did not notice that the carpenter, a young man named Marcus Thornton, was not from Havenwood nor from anywhere nearby. He was Father Thornton's nephew, a man with no parish record, no family ledger in the diocese, just the hands of a skilled builder, and the eyes of someone who listened more than he spoke. And what he built over the course of 6 days and nights was something no colonial church had ever seen. 4 booths lined in dark oak with brass hinges and carved crosses. Yes, but also with hollow columns that ran beneath the floorboards, sloping downward toward a chamber that would become the true heart of St. Bartholomew's abasement, not for storage, but for listening. While Marcus worked above, another boy worked below Samuel Thornton, the youngest of the Thornton bloodline, trained not in woodwork, but in cipher logic and silence. He was Father Thornton's other nephew, and his duty was simple. He would sit in the chamber beneath the booths and transcribe every word, every whispered guilt, every trembling voice that asked for God's mercy. He would write in a code passed down from his uncle, a language of circles, slashes, and lines that no bishop could decipher, no confessor could recognize, and no sinner could ever trace back to its source. The Thornton cipher was not merely encryption. It was weaponization, a transformation of sacred confession into a ledger of leverage. Father Thornton blessed the booths on a Sunday morning with incense and chants that masked the smell of fresh oil and solder his voice, steady his gaze unwavering, as he declared the new chambers open to the faithful, and they came in droves eager. To confess eager to be clean unaware, they were walking into a machine, a ritual converted into transaction. Each sin measured not by its weight on the soul, but by its value to the Thornton archive. He did not strike on the first day, nor the second. He was patient. He waited for the patterns, the ones who returned too often, the ones whose guilt clung to them like sweat. He took note of names, dates, details, and soon he knew heavenward better than any census could. He knew which wives wept alone in the night, and which merchants cheated the crown. He knew the fathers who drank too much, the sons who stole, and the daughters who doubted God, and among them he found his first true mark, not for punishment, not for forgiveness, but for investment, a man whose confession would yield not only silence, but sustenance. But that man would come later, for now Father Thornton stood before his growing congregation, his sermons sharp-edged and honey-tongued, filled with warnings of eternal damnation and gentle nudges toward repentance. He preached not fire and brimstone, but erosion. Sin, he said, was like water. It wore away at the soul, quietly, patiently, until nothing remained but weakness. And in that weakness the devil built his home. He told them that God had given them a gift, a priest who would listen, who would guide, who would not judge, but would help them cleanse themselves completely and in private. He began his other sermons, the ones written in code, the ones sent by Ryder to Baltimore, to Easton, to Chestertown, letters that looked like spiritual reflections, but held blueprints, maps, instructions, and names, always names. The darkness that took root in heavenwood did not come with thunder or blood, came with candles and parchment, with kneeling men and murmured shame. And every day the Thorntons listened and wrote and calculated. Every day the booths became fuller, and the church coffers heavier. But more than that, the archive grew. It grew like fungus beneath the floor, unseen, unspoken, but deadly all the same. And when the first man finally came forward with a sin that mattered, a sin that could ruin a life, Father Thornton did not flinch. He offered grace. He offered understanding. He offered a way to help the church, help others while helping oneself. He did not say the word blackmail. He did not need to. The sin had already been monetized, the price already set, the silence already purchased. And all the while heavenwood slept beneath the ringing of its church bell, believing it was safe, believing that the man who stood behind the altar was God's voice on earth, not knowing he was something else entirely, something older, something colder, something that did not pray but prayed. As winter approached and the days shortened, the booths remained open from dawn until dusk, and the lines grew longer. Confession had become a kind of contagion, spreading from guilt to fear to compulsion, and the Thorntons smiled in the shadows of awe. Their cathedral, not because they loved power, but because they understood it. And in the smoke curling through the nave and the faint echo of voices beneath the floor, the real sermon was being written, a gospel not of salvation, but of control. And the chapter that followed would make this one seem like mercy, because the next victim was already walking toward the booth, his head bowed, his voice ready to tremble, and his soul about to be sold for a silence that would never truly come. They said confession was sacred. They said what passed through that narrow grate was between man and God and no one else. But what they never told you, what they never even whispered, was that in heavenwood in the winter of 1734, those whispered sins traveled through the walls like smoke, through a chimney not up to heaven, but down into the earth, into a basement thick with mildew and paper and the quiet scratching of a pen. Father Thornton's nephew Samuel was not a boy of faith. He was a boy of obedience, trained since childhood, not in the catechism, but in shorthand encryption and patience. He could transcribe a confession in real time, never missing a syllable, never faltering, even when the words were choked with tears or shamed into a whisper. And above him, just feet away, parishioners knelt and bled themselves dry into the mouths of oak and brass, not knowing that their voices passed through tin tubes that ran beneath, the stone floor angled to carry every syllable to the ears of the waiting machine. The machine was not made of gears or pulleys or fire. It was made of design of angles of sound. It was the invention of Marcus Thornton, whose hands were steady and whose eyes betrayed nothing. He built the booths from dark oak, imported through the port under a false invoice marked for altar repair. He worked only at night when the church was empty, when the mice scurried between pews and the wind clawed at the windows. He wore gloves not out of fear of splinters, but to avoid leaving fingerprints. And the tools he used were not just for carpentry. They were for concealment, for precision, for invisibility. Each booth appeared ordinary to the eye, a central chamber for the priest, two flanking compartments for penitents' intricate crosses carved. Into the panels, the smell of incense still soaked into the grain, but inside the walls hollow tubes, coiled like veins, and beneath the booths. They converged in a locked chamber, lined with metal plates that curved and amplified sound down there. In the dark, with a lantern and a cipher book, Samuel wrote it all down, name, date, sin, intent, and weakness. The Thorntons called it their archive, but it was more than that. It was a map of human failure, a ledger of vulnerability, a record of the colony's invisible bleeding, and every line written in that cipher was another inch of rope placed around the neck of someone who thought they were speaking only to God. They recorded adulteries, yes, and embezzlements and heresies and blasphemies, but they also recorded envy, resentment, doubt, and secret ambitions. They recorded whispers about unpaid debts, suspicions about business partners, and buried secrets that no one else had heard, not even spouses, not even friends, because the church had taught them that confession was the safest place in the world. But Havenwood was no longer a church. Havenwood was a listening post, a hunting ground, and every day brought new intelligence. Some sins were dismissed if they belonged to the poor, the powerless, the harmless, but others were marked productive sins. They called them in their correspondence sins that could be monetized, that could be turned into monthly payments, or influence, or silence. The first of these was Richard Whitmore, the tobacco merchant, whose soul had slipped between the thighs of a young indentured girl, but he was only the beginning, only the proof of concept. The Thorntons began to refine their system. They built ledgers, cross-referenced names, grouped by family wealth, land holdings, political influence, even bloodline. They mapped which families controlled which warehouses, which ships, which roads. They tracked who visited whom, who argued, who drank, who wept at funerals, and who did not. Every confession fed into this growing organism, until the Thorntons knew the town better than its mayor, better than the governor, better than God. But they needed more than Havenwood. They needed replication, and so came the expansion father. Thornton wrote to his contacts in the church, suggesting that his nephews be ordained and placed in neighboring parishes. He cited their zeal, their craftsmanship, their passion for confession. He made the argument that they could revive struggling communities, and the church believed him, or chose to. He secured positions for Marcus at St. Michael's in Easton and for Samuel at St. Joseph's near Chestertown. And within weeks, new confessionals were being installed, each more elaborate than the last, with improved acoustics, with more subtle tube angles, with better drainage for the humidity, and beneath them new chambers were carved, new desks placed, new ciphers learned. The system expanded not like fire, but like mold, creeping through wood, quiet, patient, unstoppable, and every parish brought new data, new names, new sins. The Thorntons began using traveling merchants as couriers, men who carried their coded letters between towns under the guise of delivering prayer books or linens or wine. The letters appeared harmless passages from scripture, reflections on sermons, but inside them were orders, coordinates, victim profiles, and payment records. And when the letters returned, they brought updates: who had paid, who had resisted, who had confessed something new. They built a language of substitution. Father could mean subject, redemption meant payment, atonement meant risk. Danger was expressed through the names of saints, betrayal through the mention of apocryphal texts. And if someone needed to disappear, If someone had become unstable, the word purgation was used. Once purgation appeared in a letter, the Thorntons took action. And what that meant exactly would soon become horrifyingly clear. By the summer of 1735, they had a stable network, 3 churches and 12 regular contributors, men and women who confessed once and paid forever, who came to believe that their donations were acts of spiritual generosity, who convinced themselves that their blackmail was really penance, who prayed harder and sinned more carefully and walked through life like glass figurines on the edge of a shelf. But the Thorntons were not satisfied. They wanted the entire colony. They wanted Baltimore. They wanted Annapolis, and they began to plan for a regional structure, a hierarchy of control with each church as a node and each priest as both confessor and collector. But something was changing in the archive. Samuel noticed it first, a pattern in the confessions, a repetition. Some of the sins were no longer real. They were performative. They were spoken with an edge, with hesitation that did not feel like guilt, but like bait. And then came the first false confession, a woman claiming to have stolen lace from a merchant she had never visited. And when Father Thornton mentioned it in his sermon, she did not flinch. She smiled, and something in that smile shook him, because it meant someone was testing the system. Someone was listening to the listeners. And that meant the Thorntons had a new problem, one they could not control through letters or payments or servants, one that could not be silenced with threats or charity. It meant someone else knew, and in the dark, beneath the confessional booths. Samuel continued to write, but now his pen trembled, and above him the voices were changing, growing sharper, not with sin, but with suspicion. And it was only a matter of time before one of those voices would bring down the entire machine or die trying. Richard Whitmore did not think of himself as a sinner. He thought of himself as a man who had made a mistake, a single moment of weakness during a business trip to Annapolis in November of 1734, when the rum had dulled his judgment and the girl at the tavern had looked at him, not like a merchant, not like a husband, not like a man of standing, but like a man who could still be wanted, who could still be something more than a name on a ledger or a hand signing trade documents. Her name was Catherine Mills, 19, indentured to the Brass Lantern Tavern, owned by a man named Jonathan Pierce. Her eyes were green, her laugh was sharp, and Richard did not plan what happened. It just happened, and then it happened again and again, and then it was too late to pretend it hadn't. But Richard was not stupid. He knew what he was risking, not just his marriage to Margaret, or his reputation, or his business contacts, but something deeper, something harder to name. The quiet sense of control that he had spent his life building, the knowledge that every part of his world rested on a foundation of respect and routine and secrecy. So when he stepped into the confessional that cold morning in February 1735, his breath misting in the air as he knelt behind the carved panel and whispered his sin into the wood, he believed he was releasing something. He believed that God would take it from him, that it would vanish into the air like steam from the docks. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that his voice traveled not to heaven, but down through a tin tube into a hidden chamber beneath the church, where Samuel Thornton sat with a blank page and a sharpened quill and wrote every word. In the cipher his uncle had created, the details were specific. Catherine Mills indentured. Servant location, Brass Lantern Tavern, Annapolis employer, Jonathan Pierce relationship, began November 1734. Ongoing intentions to purchase indenture contract. Richard's voice trembled as he confessed. He begged for absolution. He spoke of shame, of temptation, of his vow to end the affair. But he had already met with a man about the purchase. He had already drawn the funds. Father Thornton offered comfort, his voice low and rich with practiced sympathy. He spoke of God's mercy, of the beauty of repentance, of the weight of sin, and the likeness of forgiveness. He said the church had new projects that needed support. Funds to help young women like Catherine, who found themselves in compromised positions. He suggested that Richard might consider a contribution as part of his penance. Something meaningful, perhaps £50 now and £10 monthly going forward. To assist in these efforts, Richard hesitated. The amount was large, but not devastating, and the alternative was unthinkable, and so he agreed, telling himself it was charity, telling himself it was redemption. He left the church lighter, unaware that he had just become the Thorntons' first instrument, the first proof that the system worked, that sin could be mined like ore and melted into gold. The payment was made quietly in the form of a church donation. Margaret saw the receipt and praised his generosity, said she was proud to be married to a man who gave so freely to the Lord. Richard smiled, but his hands were cold, and he could not explain why. Father Thornton waited 3 weeks before increasing the monthly payment to £15, citing inflation and the growing needs of the parish. Richard did not argue. He paid and paid and paid, and the confessional became a ritual, not of healing, but of maintenance, each visit a transaction, each prayer a receipt. The affair with Catherine ended, but the payments did not, because the sin had already been recorded, already catalogued, already stored in the archive, and Father Thornton reminded him gently that redemption was not a one-time purchase, but a lifelong subscription. Richard's demeanor began to change. He withdrew from social engagements. He avoided eye contact. He developed a nervous tic in his right hand and took to walking the docks at night, as if looking for something he had lost. His wife noticed, but said nothing. She assumed business troubles. She prayed for him and encouraged him to speak more often with Father Thornton, which he did, always kneeling, always confessing, always paying. But the Thorntons had learned something more than just the effectiveness of blackmail. They had learned how to shape guilt, how to feed it, how to let it ferment into obedience. They began experimenting with techniques, adjusting their tone, timing their follow-up. Some victims required threats, others required kindness. Richard needed to believe he was still good, needed to believe he was saving others, and so they fed him that fantasy. They spoke of new funds, of young women protected, of souls lifted from poverty by his generosity. They never mentioned Catherine again, except once in April, when Father Thornton casually noted during a sermon that certain women were no longer employed at disreputable taverns in Annapolis, and that the church's mission had touched lives in ways too delicate to speak aloud. Richard wept in the pew, and Margaret held his hand and never asked why. Meanwhile, beneath the floorboards, Samuel filed the transcripts in a leather-bound volume, marked Whitmore, and began a second file marked Mills, which contained not only her connection to Whitmore, but to several other merchants who had stayed at the tavern and whom she had likely spoken to or served or smiled at. The Thorntons were not just building a ledger of sin, they were building a web mapping connections, mapping desires, mapping potential. Catherine's indenture was never purchased. She vanished from the tavern a month after Richard ended the affair, and when he asked about her during a trip to Annapolis, the barkeep shrugged and said she'd run off or been sold south, but he couldn't remember which. Richard never asked again. But in Havenwood, the system was being perfected. The booths were tested, the acoustics calibrated, the ledgers expanding, and Richard Whitmore was the template. Every new victim measured against his profile, his behavior, his pliability, and Father Thornton realized that it was not the size of the sin that mattered, but the depth of the shame. How deeply a man believed he deserved to be punished determined how long he could be controlled, and Richard believed in punishment, like a priest believed in God. The Thorntons shared the Whitmore files with Marcus and Samuel and instructed them to find their own Richards in Easton and Chestertown, and they did, and the letters they sent back glowed with phrases like promising penitent and ripe with regret, and redemption possible with financial sacrifice. And the blackmail grew like ivy, quiet, patient, insidious, and Richard continued to pray, continued to pay, and never knew that he had become the cornerstone of an empire built on whispered guilt and dye, sacred lies. And when his wife asked him one night why he had taken to locking his study door, he said it was to protect the ledgers, but he was lying, and he didn't even know why, and outside the window, the bell of St. Bartholomew's rang in the yell. Distance and sounded not like salvation, but like chains. By the summer of 1735, the Thornton family understood that what they had built in Havenwood was not just a method of control. It was a blueprint, a living machine that fed on guilt and silence and obedience, and like all machines, it could be replicated. Refined, scaled, but only if the expansion was precise, only if the new sites were chosen not for their holiness, but for their vulnerability and potential. And so the next phase began quietly with letters of transfer and whispers to the archdiocese, and polite petitions for reassignment that made it seem like a matter of spiritual renewal, when in fact it was a movement of operatives, soldiers in cassocks, marching not with swords, but with parchment and tubes and black ink. Marcus Thornton was installed at St. Michael's in Easton, a port town dense with tobacco wealth and layered corruption, where confessions came easy and loyalty was transactional. He arrived with sermons about humility and charity and a proposal to improve the confessionals, to encourage more frequent penance and strengthen the spiritual core of the parish. And no one questioned it, because he wore the collar and spoke with conviction, and the money came from the Thornton family trust. And if the booths were elaborate, if the craftsmanship seemed excessive, no one objected, because it was a gift, and gifts are rarely inspected. Samuel Thornton took over St. Joseph's in Chestertown, further inland, but no less profitable, nestled in a region where land disputes and labor exploitation were common, and where the faithful came to confession not out of love, but out of fear. Samuel, younger, quieter, wore innocence like a veil, but behind his eyes was the same arithmetic that ruled his uncle's soul. He kept the cipher in his pocket at all times, and within a month had identified 5 men whose sins were both severe and useful: adultery, embezzlement, tax fraud, all documented, all transcribed, and all transformed into monthly donations to the church's many missions. The letters between the 3 Thorntons were constant, but always disguised as spiritual. Correspondence reports about prayer groups and women's guilds and youth initiatives that contained within them layers of code. God is moving quickly among the merchants in Easton meant 2 new targets had confessed. Marcus is praying heavily for the widows in his care meant a landowner had confessed to coercion, and a new payment was incoming. The network had language, now had protocols, and each new parish meant more data, more leverage, more silence. They did not attempt to blackmail everyone. It would have been reckless, noisy, unsustainable. They chose selectively. They targeted what they called productive sins, committed by men with status and assets and reputations to lose, and they left the poor alone unless their sin connected them to someone richer, more dangerous, more useful. They built profiles like surgeons charting weaknesses, fears, secrets, pressures. They used sin not just as a weapon, but as currency, as collateral, and every confession booth became both altar and vault, both sacred space and trap. And the targets paid, and the priests smiled and delivered sermons about generosity and the grace of giving, and spoke of God's mysterious ways, and thanked the faithful for their growing support of the church's charitable works. And the parishioners applauded, not realizing the donations had come from fear, not faith, from shame, not love. In Havenwood, Richard Whitmore continued his payments, but he was no longer the only one. He was now a part of a silent club, a society of the broken, who walked among the rest of the town, unchanged on the outside, but hollowed out within. And Father Thornton began to speak in his sermons about the burden of secrets and the courage of confession, and those who knew the truth felt the words like knives in their chests, and nodded, solemnly afraid to speak even to each other, because they didn't know who else was marked, who else was paying, who else might be listening. And the Thorntons kept records, meticulous, obsessive ledgers of names and sins and dates and payment histories, coded and cross-referenced and stored in hidden chambers beneath each church. They created maps of guilt, networks of shame, and began to see patterns emerging: family lines, political ties, business rivalries. They started to predict who might fall next, who might be pressured, who might crack under spiritual suggestion, and they tested these theories, and they were right more often than not. But they also began to encounter resistance. Small at first, a man who refused to pay another, who moved away a widow who confronted her priest and accused him of betrayal and was found dead weeks later after a sudden illness. And while the Thorntons claimed grief and performed the rites with all the expected reverence, they also made notes in their file symbols next to the names of those who had proven problematic, and began discussing how to manage risks, how to protect the system, how to ensure silence, not just through shame, but through fear. Father Thornton returned to Havenwood in late August and held a private meeting with his nephews in the basement of St. Bartholomew, and they lit no candles and spoke in whispers, even though no one was there, and they agreed that the network could grow, but only if managed like a syndicate, like a business, and that meant standardization, templates, protocols, chains of communication, and above all, containment. The operation could never be allowed to reach too far too fast. They needed loyalty from within and blindness from without. And so they began to recruit not just family, but trusted allies, priests with debts, priests with secrets, who had already wandered close to the edge and needed only a push, and they offered them power and protection and purpose. And slowly, the Thornton influence began to bleed into other towns, other parishes, not through violence, not through politics, but through theology twisted, reframed, repurposed, until the very language of salvation became a tool of bondage, and God's mercy became a mask for extortion. And in the homes of the faithful things began to change subtly. A merchant who once laughed loudly at the tavern now drank alone in silence. A plantation owner who had once walked proudly through his fields now jumped at shadows and rechecked locks, and a widow whose donations had always been modest now gave with desperate frequency and avoided the priest's gaze. And beneath the earth, in the hidden rooms, the records grew heavier, thicker, layered with ink and secrets and hope, drained through the cracks in the stone walls, and Samuel wrote each page with steady hands and never paused and never asked why, because he knew that the truth was not just dangerous. It was inevitable. The truth was a machine, and it was growing, and it did not need permission. And so the Thorntons smiled and preached and expanded, and the faithful listened and prayed and paid, and the air in the confessionals grew thicker, and the walls began to whisper, and no one could tell whether the voice they heard was their priest, or their God, or something far older, and far colder, and far more patient, waiting, always waiting for the next sin, for the next soul, for the next willing sacrifice. By the end of 1735, the Thornton network no longer resembled a mere family operation. It had become something else, something that breathed and adapted and fed on fear like an organism, stitched together from guilt and secrecy and silence. It was no longer just about gathering secrets. It was about shaping them, about crafting a world where confession was no longer the doorway to redemption, but the first step into captivity. And the most terrifying part was that the victims did not even know they were captives. They believed they were saved. They believed they were holy. They believed that their suffering was a form of grace. Father Thornton began preaching not just about sin, but about responsibility, about spiritual reparation, about how those blessed with wealth had a divine obligation to lift up the fallen, and that obligation often came with a price, a very specific price, one that arrived in private meetings, in darkened rooms, where he reminded his victims of their darkest moments, not as threats, never as threats, but as opportunities to show their devotion. He used words like calling mission burden. He wrapped his blackmail in scripture, and his victims thanked him for it. Richard Whitmore was no longer the man who had first knelt in that confessional. His hands trembled even when holding a prayer book. He no longer spoke freely at town gatherings. His business decisions grew cautious. his generosity more conspicuous. He doubled his payments in the spring of 1736, without being asked, simply because he had begun having dreams where his sins were read. Aloud before the entire congregation, he started writing letters to his wife, apologizing for things she never knew about, hiding them beneath the floorboards of their bedroom, as if confession had become a living thing in his home, watching him, judging him. Edmund Curthers, another early victim, had once been a man of spreadsheets and ledgers and confidence. He had built a tobacco empire with ruthless efficiency, but now he obsessed over numbers in a different way, counting his donations to the church, down to the penny, keeping copies of receipts and cross-checking them with dates of his confessions, terrified that a missed payment might bring divine punishment or something worse. He stopped trusting his staff, dismissed 2 overseers without explanation, began holding Mass for his slaves every Sunday, something no one had ever seen him do before. But there was no grace in it, only panic. And it wasn't just the men, it was their wives, their daughters, their sons, who began to change sometimes, without even knowing why. They grew quieter, more devout, more anxious. They attended confession more often, some of them, multiple times a week. Even when they had nothing to confess, they made things up, small sins, imagined transgressions, anything to purge the growing sense that something in their soul had begun to rot from within. And Father Thornton encouraged it. He welcomed them with open arms, spoke gently, asked questions, made notes in his mind, and sometimes on paper, about who their husbands were, their fathers, their brothers. And this created a cycle, a feedback loop. The more they confessed, the more control the Thorntons had, the more the priests preached about the importance of frequent confession. The more people came to confess, it became a ritual not of cleansing, but of feeding the Thornton machine, feeding it shame and fear and the illusion of holiness, and the machine grew. Smarter, it learned what words worked best, what tone, what posture. It learned when to lean in, when to pause, when to bless, and when to demand, and it began to standardize. Every donation was framed as penance, as sacred duty, and the Thorntons began naming these payments after saints: St. Lucia's Relief Fund, St. Thomas's Education Fund, St. Michael's Widow's Alms, each one tied to a specific sin, a specific amount, a specific method of collection, so that the victims never felt they were being coerced. They believed they were giving out of love, or at least duty. And if they hesitated, there was always a sermon waiting that would speak directly to their secret, as if God himself had whispered it to the priest's ear. And they never questioned it, because to question it would be to admit that the church itself might be compromised. And that was a thought too dangerous to entertain, because it would mean there was nowhere left to hide, no sanctuary, no refuge, no absolution, just eyes watching from behind the altar, and ears listening from beneath the floorboards, and a pen slowly recording every whispered word in a language no one else could read. And the Thorntons understood this. They understood that true control was not about force. It was about narrative, about belief, about making the victims complicit in their own imprisonment. And so they refined their methods, experimented, adjusted one. Parish began sending anonymous letters to potential targets before confession, reminding them that God sees all. Another began handing out blessed coins with the parish seal embedded with tiny symbols, known only to the Thorntons to track who had paid and who had not, and everywhere the pressure increased. Children were not spared, young boys who stole apples from market stalls, girls who wrote love letters to Protestant boys were brought into confession and scolded gently and told to pray, and then their parents were contacted, not directly, never directly, but through suggestion, through implications, about spiritual weakness in the home. And those parents began donating, too, not because they were guilty, but because they were afraid that God had marked their family, afraid that their child sin might become known, afraid that someone was keeping track, and someone was. By mid-1736, the Thornton network had established a code, a structure, a theology of extortion, wrapped so tightly around Scripture that even devout theologians could not easily untangle it. They quoted Augustine, Aquinas, even Paul twisting doctrine. Into policy, into power, the poor were preached to about suffering. The rich were preached to about guilt. The middle class were preached to about pride, and every sin had a price, and every price had a ledger, and every ledger had a copy, stored in the basement beneath God's house. But perhaps the darkest development was the internal transformation within the priests themselves. Samuel Thornton, once quiet and pale and dutiful, began to smile when transcribing confessions. He developed a habit of underlining certain words, circling phrases that excited him. He started organizing the files, not just by sin or wealth, but by personality, by susceptibility, by emotional response. He began writing speculative notes. What would happen if this man were publicly exposed? What would happen if this woman lost her husband? What would happen if this family was ruined? Would they pray more? Would they resist? Would they vanish? And one night, in a letter to his uncle, he asked a question that had not yet been spoken aloud. What if confession could be used not just to control the guilty, but to manufacture guilt? What if a priest suggested a sin that had never happened? What if he implied a memory that didn't exist? What if he planted the seed and then waited to harvest the fruit? Would the penitent believe it? Would they confess it? Would they pay for it? Would they suffer, and in suffering believe? The question was never directly answered, but from that point forward, the sermons changed ever so slightly. The priests began preaching about hidden sins, about the idea that sometimes we do not even know our own darkness that the devil works through. Forgetfulness that the soul must be scrubbed clean of even potential wickedness. And parishioners began confessing things they had only dreamed, things they had only thought, things they had never done, but feared they might. And the Thorntons took it all, recorded it all, filed it all, because in the end truth did not matter. Only confession did, only fear did, only control did. And above all, the belief that God was watching, and that his voice sounded very much like the voice behind the confessional screen. And the faithful believed, and the faithful paid, and the faithful wept, and the Thorntons built an empire from there. Tears, an empire that no one outside could see, and no one inside could leave an empire so perfectly crafted that even those who felt the noose tightening around their souls still knelt, and still whispered, and still thanked the hand that choked them for the mercy of listening. By the spring of 1737, the Thornton network had evolved beyond anything even Father Thornton had dared to imagine when he first arrived in Havenwood. It no longer relied on mere secrets or isolated sins. It had become a living archive, a breathing organism made entirely from whispered guilt and suppressed memory, and the walls of the churches themselves had learned to listen. Parishioners no longer saw confession as salvation. They saw it as obligation, a ritual of cleansing, not for the soul, but for the institution. And the more they spoke, the more the church fed. The more they confessed, the more detailed the Thorntons' records became, and every whispered word was reduced to data, to patterns, to vulnerabilities, sorted, cataloged, preserved. In iron-locked cabinets beneath the altars, where the crucifix watched over a secret archive of shame. In the basement of St. Bartholomew, the transcripts had multiplied into volumes stacked in tight, alphabetical rows, indexed by name, date, sign, severity, and monetary yield. There were notations in the margins, written in the cold, slanted hand of Samuel Thornton, speculations, predictions, formulas of psychological weight that broke sins into currencies. Adultery rated highest, followed by fraud, by theft, by desire. He developed a system of flags, small symbols carved into the spine of each book, a triangle for compliant victims, a square for defiant ones, a circle for those who had attempted escape, and an unmarked black slash for the ones who had died, and no one in the town knew just how many such marks there were. It was no longer just the content of the confessions that mattered, but the metadata, the patterns of behavior that suggested where pressure should be applied. Next they tracked who visited, who, how often, who skipped Mass, who arrived late, who avoided. Communion every choice became part of the system, and from these details the Thorntons drew conclusions, built forecasts, predicted spiritual collapses like merchants, charting crop failure or disease outbreak, and through these predictions they expanded silently, methodically across the colony. By mid-year, 16 more parishes had been identified for assimilation, each one marked by certain key traits: relative wealth, Catholic majority, existing tensions with Protestant neighbors, and an absence of inquisitive clergy, and once identified. The process was the same. Letters were sent disguised as theological inquiries. Priests were contacted under the guise of spiritual reinvigoration. Offers were made to install enhanced confessionals, designed for better acoustics, for warmer atmosphere, for greater spiritual intimacy, and in each case, if the local priest agreed, he received a sealed packet containing instructions, a cipher key, and a thin leather-bound book of names. Some of these priests were family, others were indebted former seminary students educated by the Thorntons through charitable funds, and some were merely weak men who understood very quickly what was expected of them and what rewards awaited those who obeyed in silence. By the autumn of 1737, the Thornton network had its agents in Baltimore, East and Chestertown Street, Mary's, and 2 parishes near the Virginia border, all connected by courier routes that passed through tobacco farms carrying crates filled not only with wheat and letters, but also bound ledgers packed in oilskin and smelling faintly of incense and ink. Each new church became a node and an invisible map of influence, and at the center of it all was Havenwood, whose parishioners no longer dared to miss confession, whose children learned to speak softly even in their homes, whose wives stopped asking questions when their husbands fell silent at dinner and retreated to their studies with blank eyes and trembling hands. Each week, Samuel compiled intelligence reports, disguised as scripture study summaries of recurring sins, frequency analysis, breakdowns by age, gender, wealth, and marital status. He began to see the colony not as a spiritual flock, but as a machine with levers and cogs that could be pulled and turned to extract anything they wanted. The Thorntons referred to this growing database as the Index of Contrition, a name both theological and mechanical. It contained over 1,000 detailed entries by the end of that year, each one a soul, reduced to entries, lines, margins, paragraphs, of confession and cross, referenced with known associates, occupations, family, estates, debts, and land ownership, and once a soul was indexed, it was never erased. Even Beth did not close the file. It merely froze and left it open to posthumous adjustment. If new revelations surfaced, and there were always new revelations, because guilt had a way of reproducing itself like mold in the dark, and it was no longer just information they were after, it was influence, they began using confessions to manipulate not just individuals but entire communities. They would release subtle sermons targeting one family's hidden shame to pressure another into compliance. They would orchestrate charitable campaigns for widows who had confessed to secret pregnancies and use the public sympathy to silence their husbands. They began choosing which merchants received contracts, which plantation owners were investigated for tax fraud, which marriages were arranged, and which ones dissolved. They were creating reality by shaping guilt and wrapping it in divine will, and the people believed it because they had no other explanation for how. The world bent so neatly around their shame. Even more disturbing was the change in how confession was practiced itself. People began confessing not to seek forgiveness, but to protect themselves. They came weekly, daily, some twice in a single day. They confessed everything, every intrusive thought, every impure glance, every lie to their children, every frustration with their spouse, and every word was taken, written down, interpreted for threat or opportunity. And in time, many began to invent sins because silence itself had become dangerous. Because those who had nothing to confess had something to hide, and those who had something to hide might soon disappear. One such case was Elizabeth Martin, a widow whose son was born 8 months after her husband's death, She had long denied the whispers that surrounded her household, but had kept her head low, made her donations, sat quietly at Mass. Then one week, she skipped confession due to illness. The following Sunday, Father Thornton's sermon addressed the sin of bearing false witness, not just to others, but to oneself. And the next day, Elizabeth returned to the booth trembling and weeping and confessed to sins she had not committed simply to prove her piety. She increased her donations by 20%, and her file was marked with a green symbol and open eye, meaning compliant and willing to bleed. Children began to be brought in earlier. Some as young as 7 were taught to confess their dreams, their nightmares, their questions. They were told that God was always watching, that the priest spoke for him, and that their honesty would protect their families. And so they did. They told stories of overheard arguments, secret drinks, stolen bread, and sometimes of things they did not understand. And those stories were written down cross-referenced, tagged, and added to the index, and their parents were summoned to meetings told only that God had revealed certain concerns about the spiritual health of their household. At St. Joseph's Parish near Chestertown, Father Samuel initiated a new method he called guided confession, a practice in which the priest would gently ask leading questions, suggest possible sins for reflection, offer parables that mirrored the sins already suspected, and within 3 sessions, nearly every subject confessed precisely what was desired and believed it to be true. One man confessed to infidelity that had never occurred, convinced by implication and silence and guilt, and by the time his wife learned the truth, the damage was done, because what mattered now was not what had happened, but what could be used, and his file was marked accordingly. And as the walls of the churches thickened with secrets, as the archives grew heavier, and the Thorntons began whispering, not just about spiritual dominion, but economic control, legal leverage, land disputes, they began identifying key targets across the colony: justices, magistrates, councilmen, plantation lords, and Catholic nobility, whose confessions could serve as leverage for political influence. The Thornton network was no longer just a parasitic system feeding on fear. It had become a state within a state, governed by guilt, maintained by silence, and expanding through the very act of worship. In December of that year, a letter arrived in Havenwood, written in the same cipher used by all Thornton correspondences, but bearing a different hand. It was unsigned, but marked with the symbol of a flame, a code used only in emergencies. When Father Thornton read it, his hands began to tremble. The letter reported that a woman in St. Mary's Parish had confessed not to sin, but to suspicion. She had noticed inconsistencies between her confession and the sermons she had heard weeks later. She had shared these thoughts with her brother, a visiting physician from Annapolis, and both had begun making inquiries. This was the first mention of Isabella Ashford, though her name had not yet been recorded, but her description, the phrasing of her concern, the implications of her curiosity were unmistakable. A spark had ignited in a dark corner of the Thornton empire, and if left unchecked, it would spread and burn and reveal the machinery behind the altar and the blood beneath the Bible. And in that moment, Father Thornton knew that the index of contrition was no longer enough. He would need something else, a plan not for preservation, but for escalation, not just to silence the questioning, but to erase the possibility of questions entirely. And that plan would require crossing a final threshold from which even he might not return. Isabella Ashford was not the type of girl the Thorntons had learned to fear. She did not speak loudly in public or challenge sermons with dramatic proclamations. She did not write pamphlets or attend secret meetings. She moved like a shadow beneath stained glass and candlelight, always watching, never confronting. Not at first. She was the daughter of Charles Ashford, a respected merchant and 3rd generation Catholic landholder whose wealth had been matched only by his obsessive devotion to the church, and his eagerness to please Father Thornton had made him a frequent guest at Havenwood's dinners, and his confessions were lengthy, detailed, often laced with self-loathing, the perfect kind of man to own And so Thornton believed that his daughter, too, would remain loyal, blind, pliable. But he was wrong, because Isabella was nothing like her. Father, she had learned early that secrets were currency, and silence was power, and so she stayed quiet and watched and waited. It began on a Sunday in early spring 1738. During the second sermon of Lent Father, Thornton spoke of vanity and the sin of pride. He described a woman who spent her nights reading poetry by candlelight, imagining herself superior to her neighbors. And though he never spoke a name, the description struck Isabella like a blade, not because it was true, but because 2 weeks earlier she had confessed exactly that sin, not as truth, but as a moment of self-doubt, and the words had come back to her. From the pulpit, twisted, sharpened, made into a warning, and she knew in her gut that something was deeply wrong. Over the next month she tested her suspicion by planting deliberate falsehoods. She confessed to reading a banned Protestant tract. She admitted a dream in which she stole from the poor box. She described hearing a voice during Mass, whispering doubt into her ear, and then she waited, and every time some piece of her lie returned in fragments from the sermon, or in the concerned glances of parish elders, or in the sudden change in how younger girls were forbidden to visit her home, and it became clear that the confessional was not a sanctuary. It was a mouth that swallowed and spat out and bled people dry. She began keeping notes written in code and sewn into the lining of her dresses, a method she had learned from a servant whose cousin had once spied for the British Crown. She documented patterns of speech in sermons, facial expressions when certain families were mentioned, changes in seating arrangements during Mass, and the strange frequency with which the same courier arrived and departed with small crates and leather-bound satchels, always handled by the Thornton nephews, never by the church staff. She tracked when they left town, when they returned, and what had changed in the sermons after each trip, and she began to notice something more terrifying than she had imagined. It wasn't just her secrets that were bleeding through. It was everyone's. Her cousin Elaine had once confessed to desiring a married man, and weeks later that man's wife was sent to live with her sister in Delaware, never to return. Her friend Margaret had whispered about doubts in her marriage, and days later her husband's tobacco contract was revoked by a magistrate who regularly dined with Samuel Thornton. These weren't coincidences, they were patterns, networks, a map of influence, rooted in sin and shaped like a noose, and Isabella realized she was standing at the center of it, tightening. One night she followed Marcus Thornton after evening Mass, keeping to the trees along the road, as he carried a heavy crate toward the old rectory that had long been sealed for repairs. She waited until he disappeared into the side entrance and did not emerge for over an hour. When he finally left, the crate was gone, and he walked faster than before, his head low, as if burdened with guilt or secrecy, or both. She waited another hour before approaching the door. It was locked, iron-banded hold, but the hinges were polished, and the earth around the frame was disturbed. She traced her fingers along the threshold and felt something strange, a thin groove carved into the wood just beneath the handle, a place where a key had been turned many times and worn the wood smooth. She returned home with shaking hands and a plan. If she was to uncover the truth, she needed proof, not speculation, not gossip, but evidence. And if the Thorntons were building an empire of shame, then it stood to reason that the heart of it would be buried deep below the surface, beneath the pews, beneath the crucifix, perhaps even beneath the old rectory itself. And to enter that world, she would need help, someone within the church who had seen too much and said too little, someone with nothing left to lose. His name was Elias Flint, a groundskeeper at Havenwood for nearly 2 decades. Half-mute and thought to be simple, but Isabella had noticed his eyes too sharp too. Alert for a man dismissed as dull, he had once served in the militia and had scars that no gardening accident could explain, and he drank only after Mass, never before, and always alone. And when she approached him in the garden, pretending to ask about roses, she mentioned the word ledger and watched the blood drain from his face. And in that moment she knew he had seen it and perhaps even feared it more than she did. Over weeks she fed him questions wrapped in kindness, asked about the locked doors, the changing priests, the night sounds beneath the floor, and he never answered directly, but once he whispered that God does not live in the basement, and then walked away and refused to speak to her again. But the message was clear: the truth was below, and it was not divine. She began forging a key, using wax imprints stolen from Father Thornton's office when he left it unattended during a baptism she bribed the blacksmith's apprentice with promises of silver and silence, and within a week she had a working replica, hidden in her corset lined with cloth to muffle the sound. And on the night of Easter Vigil, when the town gathered for midnight prayers and the priests were occupied with the ceremony, she slipped away through the back fields toward the rectory, and felt the cold iron of the door yield beneath her trembling hand. The air inside was stale thick with the scent of old wax and something bitter like mold or medicine. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but the books were false facades glued together to hide hollow recesses filled with letters, ledgers, maps, all written in the same tight script she had seen in her father's notes pages, marked with names, dates, figures, annotations in a cipher she had already begun to understand, and among them she found files labeled with single letters: F for adultery, F for fraud, B for blasphemy, and many more, some marked with red ink, some with black, and one with a wax seal shaped like a skull. She opened it slowly, expecting blood, expecting curses, expecting death. But what she found was worse lists of names with dates of birth and death, with final donations noted beside cause of death, all marked illness, but beside each was a second column, labeled treatment with strange notation symbols that looked chemical, and one word repeated and faded, inked arsenic, arsenic, and beside that the letters DM, which she did not understand until later when she realized they stood for death managed. And then she saw her own name filed beneath the letter Q for questioning, and her file was empty, no sins, no donations, only a note written in crimson beneath. Her name observed by 3 likely to spread unknown variables, remove if necessary. And she felt the floor tilt beneath her, as if the walls themselves had turned to water, and the cross above had fallen into rot, because now she knew this was not surveillance, this was war, and the church was not a house of God, but a machine of control. And her very breath had become a liability. She heard footsteps above, muffled voices, doors opening and closing, and she froze beneath the ledgers, beneath the truth, waiting for silence. And when she emerged, the town had already resumed its prayers, singing hymns to a God who was deaf or complicit, or both, and she walked home with new eyes, new skin, new bones, hollowed by the weight of knowledge and the realization that she was not the first to see the machine, but perhaps the first to survive it. And now the question was simple: how long before? They realized the machine had been seen, and what would they do to protect it again? Isabella did not sleep that night. She sat at her writing desk with trembling hands and opened a fresh page in the notebook. Hidden beneath her mattress, the ink smeared as she wrote, but the words came quickly, carefully, deliberately. She detailed every name, every file, every code and ledger. She could recall the arsenic, the cipher, the whispers in the walls, the fake sermons, and the true victims. She included drawings of the confessional tubes, the tin that fed sin into the dark, and she marked her own name among the others, as if admitting it would somehow offer protection. She wrote until her fingers bled, until the candle guttered and died, and even then she kept writing in her mind, repeating every line like prayer or curse or warning. By morning she had packed the pages into 3 separate parcels, one bound for Bishop Carroll in Baltimore, one for Governor O. Donnell in Annapolis, and one for Thomas Ashford, her cousin, a magistrate, with a silent contempt for the clergy each was. Sealed with wax, pressed with her family ring, and wrapped in oilskin, and she delivered them herself. Before Mass, walking like a ghost through the marketplace, no longer a girl, not yet a murder, but something in between. She gave no sign that she had already broken open a truth that would never again be caged. The town awoke slowly that day under skies. The color of lead children played in dust merchants, set up stalls, and the bell at St. Bartholomew rang out over the fields, calling souls to service. But Isabella did not answer it. She stood on the hill, behind her house, watching the church as though waiting for it to collapse inward or burst into flames. Neither happened what did happen, was quieter and worse, Father. Thornton did not look surprised. When she failed to appear, he did not send for her. He did not question her absence. Instead, his sermon that morning spoke of wolves in sheep's clothing, of daughters who betray fathers, and heretics who disguise themselves as angels. And the parishioners nodded and whispered and turned their heads to the empty pew where Isabella always sat. That evening she returned to the rectory one final time, not to search, but to destroy. She carried a flask of whale oil and a flintstone, and as she opened the basement chamber, she felt the breath of 100 recorded sins rise up like heat against her face. She spilled the oil slowly across the wooden shelves, the leather bindings, the piles of transcribed agony, then struck the flint, and watched the flame catch like it had been waiting for centuries to come alive. The fire climbed fast, hungry and hot, and as she fled into the night, she did not look back, not when the windows shattered, not when the smoke rose like incense, not even when the bell tower cracked and collapsed inward with a moan like a dying god. The fire consumed more than the records. It devoured the silence of Havenwood. It burned through whispers and secrets and lies. And when dawn came, the townspeople stood before the ruins in stunned silence. The Thorntons claimed it was sabotage. They preached of Protestants, of jealous rivals, of madness. But the damage was done, and something deeper had broken beneath the ash. Bishop Carroll arrived 2 days later, not alone, but with soldiers and magistrates and letters in hand, sealed with the mark of 3 powerful names. Isabella's letters, their contents still unknown to the public, but enough to spark investigation. Enough to make the Thorntons disappear, one by one, not into fire, but into silence, into reassignment, into illness. Some said the bishop wept when he saw the ruins of the confessional chambers, not from grief, but from understanding. Isabella left Havenwood that spring dressed as a widow, though she had never married. She walked north through the fields, past the ruins, past the weeping oaks and the poisoned wells. She did not speak of what she had seen or what she had done, but she carried with her a small bound volume, its pages blank at first, but slowly filling day by day, not with memories, but with warnings. She called it the Book of Tongues, and she added to it every time she heard of another church, built in stone too thick or with confessionals too new. In the years that followed, people whispered about her, a woman who knew too much, a girl who burned down a house of God, a witness, a heretic, a prophet. Some said she went mad. Others said she never stopped writing. Some claimed she lived out her days in a convent in New York. Others that she vanished into the forests of Pennsylvania with only her journal and her silence for company. But all agreed on one thing: wherever the church built too quickly, wherever the priests listened too intently, wherever the congregation began to fear their own words, Isabella Ashford had already been there and left behind a mark, a cross not drawn in ink, but carved in wood, a warning to those who still believed the walls could not hear. And so the story ends not with justice, not with vengeance, not with peace, but with knowledge, the kind that rots the tongue that speaks it, and sickens the soul that keeps it. Knowledge buried beneath centuries of stained glass and blood. Knowledge that the act of confession is not always holy, that some priests wear collars, not to serve God, but to bind men, and that sometimes the only path to salvation is fire and silence and exile. This is the story of the Thornton confessional conspiracy, the hidden empire of blackmail that corrupted a colony and the girl who tried to end it. It is not written in the history books. It is not preached from the pulpit, but it lingers in the aisle, Grain of old wood in the silence between prayers and the unease you feel when kneeling in the dark, and it asks one question over and over again. When you whisper your sins to a stranger behind a screen, who else is listening?